Phase 7, managers. Okay, so in this particular section, we're going to create the game manager, and the idea is that by the end of it, we will have rounds with tanks where you can drive around and fire and destroy another tank. And at the end of it, you have a UI that explains that you have won that round, and then after several rounds have been won, that you've won the game. There's it turning red. And you get this text at the end. Player number wins the round. And you'll notice also that we've colored the UI to match the color of the tank. So we're going to start by creating the spawn points for each tank. So for that, we just need a position reference in the world. So we're going to use an empty game object for that. It's very simple. We're just going to go to the hierarchy and we're going to choose create empty. I'm going to rename this one spawn point 1. Then I'm going to duplicate it, Control D or Command D, depending on your platform, and call it spawn point 2. And I'll give you some positions for those. So spawn point number 1 is -3, 0, 30, with a rotation of 0, 180, and 0. It's going to be a lot quicker to read it off of the slide because I've got both spawn points on at once. So spawn point 1, position -3, 0, 30, rotation 180 in the y-axis and 0 in the other two. Spawn point 2, 13, 0, -5, ensuring a rotation of spawn point 2 is 0, 0, 0. And naturally, this is one of those things that's not going to make a huge difference. If you guys decide that you want to move those spawn points somewhere else in your game, feel free to go ahead and do that. Obviously, you want to keep the y-axis position at 0 at all times, because that's where you want the tanks to start. Because we're dealing with these spawn points, which are effectively what we call empty game objects, something that just has a transform component, it's very difficult to see them in the scene. So you have to select the translate tool to be able to see their handles. So spawn point 1 is here. Spawn point 2 is over here. Now, there's a quick way to rectify that, which is to select the spawn point and give it what we call a gizmo. So gizmo is a 2D representation of something in the scene view. So if you reselect spawn point 1, and then at the top of the inspector, there's this little cube icon. If you click down, you can choose from a number of gizmos. You can specify your own. If you bring in a texture in Unity, you can set that as the gizmo, which is super handy. But for this, we're just going to select a blue background. So that's going to then print the name, spawn point 1, just like that. And then we'll do the same for spawn point 2. We're going to choose red. So that's going to match the color of our tanks that we're spawning as well. So spawn point 2 is red, spawn point 1 is blue. Okay, so that's where my two spawn points are. So we just, design-wise, decided to put them either side of a building so that the players have to at least drive around to start shooting in the game. So that's gizmos. So the next thing we need to do is to create a screen space canvas. So when we first put in a UI element into the game, the slider for the health, I mentioned that ordinarily our UI is over the entire screen. So that's what we're going to do now. So in the hierarchy, I'm just going to choose the Create menu. I'm going to choose UI and Canvas. And yet again, it's going to appear huge, and it should look like that if you've done it right. And you can't really get it wrong because that's the default. Then what we're going to do is rename this Message Canvas. So F2 on PC or a return on Mac, just rename it Message Canvas. Now, we want to work with this canvas a little bit and add a text element that's going to be the basis of our messaging at the end of each round. So what I'm going to do is, first off, I'm going to set the scene view to 2D mode. So at the top, there's a little button here by the scene tab that says 2D. Click on that. That's going to constrain to a particular axis. Then what I'm going to do is to click on my message canvas, and you can either hover over the scene view and press F on the keyboard to frame, or you can go to Edit Frame Selected. Then you can just use your scroll wheel or a gesture on your trackpad, if that's what you're using, to kind of frame that in the scene view. Then what we're going to do is actually add a text field. So I'm going to right click on my message canvas so that I'm immediately creating something under that parent object. And I'm going to choose UI Text. What you should see then is that you have something called New Text. It's a new text field it's left aligned, and it's kind of sat in the middle of our canvas. Should look like that. So basically with this thing, we want it to be nice, huge text, and we want it to be stretched over most of the screen except for a kind of a border around the edge. So depending on what we put into it, we'll use best fit on the text, which will scale it if there's too much information on the screen, but ultimately fit it into this canvas. So on the rect transform for the text, the anchors for X and Y should have a minimum of 0.1 and a maximum of 0.9. So it should look like this. So note that it's X, Y across, and then X, Y across again. So min is the first two values, max is the second. So 0.1, 0.1, 0.9, 0.9. Then what we're going to do is reset all of these values. So the anchors are basically where those edges start from. So if I put those all to 0, and I say that X and Y should have 0.1, it's going to take that as a proportion of the screen that we've got. So you should now see that your screen looks like this. It's got this border around the outside, and our text is basically starting up in the upper left there. Okay, so we've made a new message canvas. We've added a text new game object to it. And on the rect transform, the anchors for X and Y have a minimum of 0.1, maximum of 0.9. Just creating this pad around the outside. Obviously it varies depending on width and height because of the aspect ratio being wider than it is tall. And I've reset all of those left, right, top, bottom to 0. So then we'll actually work with the text component. With that text game object still selected, we're going to scroll down to our text component, which is here. So obviously the main characteristic of text is what it actually says. So I'm going to write in tanks. You can do that, or I'm sure you can name the game something hilariously different. So feel free to do that. And then the font that we've included for you guys, which is a free for use font, is one called Bolby1 Regular. So next to the font field, just use the circle select to change from the default Arial to that. And then because this entire block here is that text field, we want to set the alignment under the paragraph section to center and middle. So that will place it right in the center of the screen. Then finally what we're going to do is enable best fit and set the maximum size to 60, and the color to white. So the font is Bolby1 Regular. I've enabled best fit, which will give me a min and max size. I set the maximum to 60. And then I've set my color to white just by dragging up in this color panel. It should look like this if you've got it right. Okay, so this might be tricky to see. So what we're going to do is just add a drop shadow to it. Nice and simple. And for that, we have a separate component. So if you click the add component button and just type in shadow, that will jump straight to that very simply, and you can hit return. And for the shadow, we're going to set the color. So first off, we're going to choose a kind of brown color to go with the sand. So that is 114, 71, 40, and the alpha remains the same. Should be 128. Then, because that's only just poking out from just behind the tank's actual text, I'm going to set the effect distance to -3 in X and Y. Should look like that. If you want to get artistic at this point, feel free. And finally, once we've designed that, I'm just going to save my scene real quick. And then I'm going to disable 2D mode because I don't want to look at this stuff anymore. I want to go back to actually messing with my level. So I'm going to uncheck 2D mode on the scene view. And then I'm going to select my level art and I'm going to frame that and then zoom back into where I was. So one more time, I was on my message canvas in 2D mode, framed. I'm just going to reselect my level art, hover, press F to frame when not in 2D mode and zoom in. We've added our text component and we've set the text to say tanks or something otherwise hilarious. We have used circle select to choose our font. That font is Bolby1 Regular. It's a free font that we took from Google. Thank you, Google. We've set the alignment to center and middle so that it sits right in the center of where we've set it up. We've enabled best fit. So basically best fit will allow that to scale up to the maximum size. So if we end up putting a lot of text into this text field, then it will be between 60 and 10, which is the default minimum. If the amount of text forces it to be smaller, those are the things that will be between before it starts actually clipping over the edge of the rectangle. Then we set the color to white, and we added a shadow component to the text. And we set the effect color to be brown and -3 for the distance. So it's back to the left and down a little. And then we disabled 2D modes to go back to the level itself. Then we need to get back to actually framing our tank and worrying about how the camera will behave when there's more than one tank. So what I'm going to do is to select my camera rig game object. Now, what you'll notice with the camera rig is that we now have something missing. So before, we dragged our single tank on and dropped it onto the targets array, the thing at the bottom here, this thing. Now, it has a size of 1 because we already populated that field, but this is missing because we deleted our tank, so it can't find it anymore. But that's fine because we don't actually want this to be there at all. We want the script to handle it for us. So what I'm going to do is to go to my camera control script. I'm going to set my size back to 0, so it doesn't exist anymore. And then I'm going to double click on my camera control script to go back to editing it.
So you may remember when we first came across this, there was that hide in inspector bit at the top. And now comes the time to uncomment that bit so that this targets field is no longer seen in the inspector.
So we're not deleting that part, we're just removing the slash and asterisk either side of it.
So it should look like this.
Yeah.
So when you save your script and return to the editor, you'll notice that the camera control no longer shows that bit. And compiled.
There we go. Okay, so your targets array should disappear. It's still there, it's still accessible by other scripts. It's just not visible for you to drag and drop stuff onto, which is exactly what we needed. Then we are ready to actually create our game manager. So I'm going to save my scene, and I'm going to use the hierarchy create button to create an empty, and I'm going to name it Game Manager. So we're just using this as a thing that can host our Game Manager script. So, you know, we could really attach this to anything. We could attach it to the level art or, you know, something that we know is always going to be in the scene. But for our purposes, it just makes sense to have a dedicated game object we can select and go back and set everything up on. So our game manager is going to be an independent object. So in the scripts managers folder, you will find 2 files. One of them is the game manager. One of them is the tank manager. And we'll come on to explain what the tank manager does shortly. For now, I'm going to just grab my game manager and drop it onto my game manager object. So grab the game manager script, drop it onto the game manager object. So let's actually do things the other way around this time. We're going to populate these variables and then we'll look at the script and see how it works, because there's a fair bit to it. So we have a number of rounds to win. As we said earlier, there are 5 rounds to win. There's a start and end delay to each round, which will allow the players to actually read the text that's on the screen. And then there is a reference to our camera control. So remember we said that this script would tell the camera where the tanks were and instantiate them and whatnot. So it needs a reference. So that's the first thing we're going to set up. So the camera rig has that camera control script attached to it. So this is expecting something of type camera control. So that component is attached to the camera rig. So if I just drag and drop my camera rig onto that, that will assign it. Then under message canvas, I have my text game object. That's my message text. I'm going to drag and drop that on to assign it to. And finally, my tank prefab, I'm going to zoom out a little, is in my prefabs folder. So I'm going to select prefabs. I'm going to grab and drop my tank on there. Then you will notice conspicuously there is an array at the bottom called tanks, which, if you expand, has no size. So, as we know, there are 2 tanks in our game. So the size needs to be 2. So there are 2 items in this array. Player 1 tank, player 2 tank. So if you expand that, once you've typed in 2 and hit return, you will see that there's element 0 and element 1. So just a reminder, any array always starts at 0. So that's why you're seeing, instead of 1 and 2, 0 and 1. So the two things that we actually need here are just the color that we want it to be. So this color will apply to the tank itself, and it will also apply to the name of the tank or the name of player 1, player 2 in the UI itself. So this color will get used for both of those things. So I'm going to set up red and blue for this. So element 0, I'm going to click on the color block. So that big black square there, click on that to bring up the color picker. And then the color I'm going to use there is 42, 100, and 178. So shade of blue like that.
You'll notice that this conspicuously matches the name tag gizmo that we gave spawn point 1. Funny that.
So we will drag on spawn point 1 as the spawn point. Then element 1 will have a different color. And that is a red, which is 229. I'm going to recap these in a moment. 229, 46, and 40. 229, 46, and 40, RGB. And you guessed it, spawn point 2 is the spawn point to drop on. We've expanded our tanks array, so the game manager will create these tanks and color them and also color the UI for us. We assigned all of our references, like the text and the camera rig. And then the colors we've used are blue of 42, 100, 178. That's for spawn point 1. And then color of red, 229, 46, 40 for spawn point 2, which should also be dragged on. Okay, so let's talk about our game manager. So the game manager is in charge of the game, weirdly enough, the clue's in the name. But the way that works is pretty much what you're seeing here. So it's in charge of initializing the game. It needs to spawn as many tanks as we've told it to. So in this case, 2. And it needs to set up the camera targets. So it needs to say, hey, camera control, these are the tanks that I've spawned and you need to focus in on them when the game starts. Then it needs to run the states of the game. So we're going to look at the code in the game manager shortly. And you'll see that it's basically a simple sort of state machine that's running round starting, what happens during the round playing, and what needs to be decided when the round ends. And all these things link into the tank manager, which is a separate script. So the tank manager handles shooting and movement for the tanks, and also visual elements, i.e. the UI. So what you need to understand is that each tank gets assigned its own tank manager. And that tank manager is then in charge of turning off input, control, and shooting. So every time that tank gets spawned in the world, it doesn't know what it's got to do, but it has this tank manager there to kind of sort it out. So obviously this game is extensible, so we've put this kind of third one there to kind of mean and so on. You know, as we populate that array with more tanks, you could do more things.
So shall we have a quick look at the tank manager script?
Yeah, sure.
Because that is the first one that we need to understand.
Double click on the icons to open both those scripts up. And make sure you're looking at the tank manager.
So the tank manager is already complete, and we'll go through that briefly now so you can understand what it's doing, what its role is, and how it interacts with the game manager. So most of the scripts that we're dealing with today, in fact, all of them other than this one, are mono behaviors. So after it says public class, and then the name of the class, you've got a colon, and then mono behavior.
Camera control. Mono behavior.
So what that means is that this script you can drop onto a game object, and it will have functions that are called back, such as awake, start, update, fixed update, those sorts of things. That's all part of mono behavior. But this one does not have that. It's not inheriting from anything before that. So everything that you see in Tank Manager is its own thing. We've also got this attribute at the top, serializable. So what that's doing is saying to Unity, when you have an instance of this, you can show it in the inspector. Most of the time you don't need that because by default fields are serializable. But when you've got a class that you make yourself, you need to mark it as serializable so that it'll show up in the inspector. Okay, so let's have a look at the public variables. So we already know the first two. We've got the color, which is the color that the player is going to be when it's spawned, the tank, and its name. And we've got a transform representing the spawn point. So that's obviously where and in what direction it's going to be spawned.
So very crucially, what you're actually seeing here is the result of what you just filled in the inspector. So in the inspector, we have this thing called tanks. So each of these elements is effectively those two things. These are individual tank managers. And those are the only things that are shown in the inspector.
That's because the tanks array in the game manager is an array of tank managers. So it's showing those two because we've told it to, but the rest we're saying hide those from the inspector.
So if I jump over to game manager real quick. So there's an array of tank managers. So these classes called tanks. So that's why you're seeing that in the inspector.
Okay. So the rest of these public fields, we've got hide in inspector to stop it from showing up because we don't want people to be able to adjust those. So first is the player number. So that's going to filter through to the shooting script and the movement script to tell each of those scripts what input it needs, because you remember they're based on the player number. Next, we've got colored player text. So you notice that when we showed that little video, the text that came up was in the color of the player. So the way you do that is you use HTML-like rich text, and we'll show you how to do that in a moment, but that's just a variable to store that. Next, we've got a game object, which is storing the instance of the tank. So if we need to turn anything on or off, we need to get that reference through the instance, and the number of wins that the tank currently has. So when it gets enough wins, it'll win the game. Next, we've got a few private references. So we've got references to the tank movement and tank shooting scripts, so we can turn those on and off when we need to. And a reference to the canvas game object so that we can turn the UI on and off. Next, we've got a public function called setup. So this is public because it's going to be called by the game manager when it first creates these tanks. Seeing as the tank has been created, it's going to find the references to the movement and shooting scripts by saying that the instance get the component from the instance. So set the instance, get the components there. Next, a little bit more obtuse, we've got the canvas game object. So what it's doing is it's got the instance, it's finding a component of type canvas in its children. Because you remember, all of the UI is underneath a canvas. So we're finding that canvas in the children, and then we're getting the game object that that's on. That's what that bit is doing there. Next, we're setting the player number on the movement and shooting scripts. And then there's the HTML-like rich text.
So this looks a little bit scary and confusing, but basically what we're doing is taking bits of text and then putting stuff in between them. So for example, if you saw in the video earlier, we showed at the end, it says player 1, X amount of wins, player 2, this how many wins. So what we're doing with this is we're just adding bits to a string. So this is a string here in inverted commas, and then we add to it something that's converting a piece of code to a particular color by using this thing called color utility to HTML string RGB. Very long-winded thing, but it basically takes in a color and will then color whatever text is after that. And the thing it's coloring is player. So if you've seen HTML before, you'll know that HTML tags fit inside angle brackets. So it starts here. It then says the color that I should color it is this thing that takes in the player color. So that will result in a color reference. Then we finish that tag, and the piece of text it's actually coloring is the word player. Then we put in a space. Then we put in the player number. And then we finish coloring. So all of that stuff is saying player 1 in a particular color by using this rich text. It looks a bit lengthy, but once you kind of piece through it, it makes sense. And like I said, have a look at the completed scripts. We'll have all the comments in there to tell you exactly what we're doing.
So the next line is getting an array of mesh renderers. So mesh renderers are the things that actually show up your 3D objects in the scene. So the tank is made up of a series of mesh renderers, like one for the tracks, one for the chassis, one for the turret, etc.
Just going to show that real quick. So I just dragged in my prefab just to demonstrate, but you'll see there's this mesh renderer component. And if I toggle things on and off, they disappear because they're not being rendered anymore. That's just what a mesh renderer is doing.
Okay, we're making an array of mesh renderers called renderers, and we're setting that to all of the components in children that are mesh renderers. So the instance, get the components in the children that are mesh renderers and return them. And then what we do is we loop through all of those renderers and set their materials color to the player's color. So all that's doing is it's finding all the mesh renderers, getting the color and changing it to the player color that we chose. Then we've got just a few more public functions that are going to be called by the game manager. We've got disable control, which turns off the scripts and turns off the canvas. And we've got enable control, turns on the scripts and turns on the canvas. Finally, we've got reset. So what reset does is it sets the instance back to its spawn point. It turns it off and then it turns it back on again. And the reason it does that is that all of the tanks, apart from the winner, will be off. But we need to reset all of them. So we need to turn everything off first before we can turn it back on again. Okay, so that's all there is to Tank Manager. Let's see about the Game Manager.
So just to jump back to the slide real quick, as we said, the Game Manager is using an array of tank managers. So when we look at the Game Manager in a second, we're going to see that at the start, it's going to use the tank managers to spawn those. So those were the instances that you just saw referenced inside Tank Manager. And then we're going to get into actually looping through things. So let's take a look at that. So if you switch over to the Game Manager script, you should see the stuff that we're looking at right now. Either that or you can look at the screen.
So there are 3 blocks of comments in this one. There's one at lines 19 and 21.
Just going to remove
get rid of those. There is one at line 66 to line 74. And then there's a really long one, which is line 108 all the way down to 152.
Cool. So yeah, apologies we had to comment those out. Otherwise you would have seen some warnings and queries in the console that kind of make it awkward for us to teach you stuff. So we just commented those out briefly.
Okay, so we've already gone over the public variables. I won't bore you by doing it again. The private variables, so we've got an integer which stores the current round number. So obviously as it counts up, then you get to display what the current round number is when it starts. And then we've got these 2 wait for seconds things. So in coroutines, you can put a delay in your function calls.
What is a coroutine, James?
I think we'll cover that shortly.
Good idea.
But basically, these wait for seconds things are what a coroutine is looking for a delay. So we've got a start delay and an end delay. We'll change those into these wait for second classes so we can use them.
So basically, we have a little pause within a function, but they need to be converted to a type that's called wait for seconds, and you'll see why shortly when we explain coroutines.
Okay, then the last 2 things, we've got 2 instances of tank managers, so they're referring to specific tanks that are the round winner and the game winner, and we'll use those for the message at the end of each round. So next we've got this start function, which is setting up those wait for seconds. So we've got a start delay and an end delay, which are just numbers in seconds, and then we're creating new wait for seconds for the start and the end. Then we've got spawn all tanks function and set camera targets function. We'll cover those now and then come back to that start coroutine thing at the end. So spawn all tanks. All that's doing is it's going to loop through the tank managers. For each tank manager, it's going to set the instance belonging to that tank manager to an instantiated prefab. So we're calling it instantiate, tank prefab, and then we're spawning it at the spawn point of the tanks.
With the same rotation.
With the same rotation.
So this may look confusing, but it's basically a long line that we've moved on to a new line because it doesn't make any difference and it's easier to fit on a projector. So we're just instantiating a tank per instance as required.
Okay, so now we've created the tank, we want to set its player number. And since this loop is going from 0 upwards, that doesn't really work as nicely as starting from 1. So we're just saying that the player number is I plus 1. So it starts at 0, so the player number would start at 1, and so on.
Otherwise, when you start the game, you'd get player 0, 1, player 1 failed. You don't want that. So you need to just add 1 so that they have a minimum of player 1, player 2, and so on.
And then finally, for each tank, we're going to call that setup function, which is the first function that we covered in tank managers.
Just a quick reminder, tank managers setup. So it's the thing that's in charge of movement, shooting, and coloring and whatnot.
Okay. So set camera targets. we're creating an array of transforms called targets, and we're setting it to be the same length as the tank manager's array. Then we're going to loop through this targets array, and we're going to set each target equal to the tank manager's instance's transform. So each tank's instance, that transform. And then finally, we can set the camera controls targets to this targets array that we just created.
So we're just looking at the tank manager and saying, okay, well, here's all the positions of the tanks you've just created, and we'll just assign them to the camera control script.
Okay, so the last thing that the start function did something called start coroutine, and then it had a function within its parameters, which is a bit weird. So let's find out what that's all about.
Okay, so just to jump back to the slides. So we've just been talking about start and what actually happens there. We say that it starts the game loop to continue. So it's starting the game loop coroutine. So we haven't talked about these yet. We've talked a lot about functions and how you can use those. We need to talk about coroutines. So the game loop is going to start the round. Obviously, you're going to start the round. People are going to start playing, driving around. It's then going to wait. And then they're going to be playing. So this is when they're actually firing, shooting each other, running around. Then it's gonna wait, and then the round's gonna end. Okay. But ordinarily in functions, when you run a function, all the commands just go straight through, and something happens, or you'll loop through something, but it's instantaneous. But often in programming, we need to kind of pause and do what we call yield, and wait for a certain number of seconds, or wait for a certain condition to be valid. And that's where coroutines come in. So an ordinary function might look like this: void, non-return type, and then the name of the function, open, close parentheses, and then some commands within that. Whereas a coroutine has, first off, you'll notice a different return type. Instead of void, we have this thing called IE numerator. As if the word coroutine wasn't weird enough, you now have something else to worry about, IE numerator. But don't be afraid of that, it's just the return type. And you'll also notice within this we have the word yield in the middle of it. So what we can do is start some basic commands, anything that we want to happen straight away, like any old function. But then we can stop at this point called yield.
At the point where you come into contact with yield, what happens is execution exits that function, goes away. Then it waits for a certain period of time or some condition to be true. And then after that period of time or that condition, it comes back in again at the same point that it yielded. And then it will continue on with the coroutine. So instead of just going straight through and doing everything instantly, you put in a little pause in the middle of your function, which could be very useful. And it becomes really useful when you start putting things like while loops in. So what you can do is have a while loop like this with a yield instruction in the middle.
So if you haven't heard of while loops, it's kind of like, if you think of an if statement of checking a condition, a while loop is just there to say, whilst this thing is still true, then we're going to do what's in those brackets.
Okay, so in this coroutine, the first part of the function would start normally, then it would hit the while loop. So let's suppose that the condition is true. It goes into the while loop and hits that yield. Then it leaves again, waits for some period of time, and then comes back into the yield and continues with that while loop. Whilst within a loop, we've exited and then come back in again after a period of time. So supposing that that condition is still true, we'll then go back into the same while loop. So let's say, for example, I don't know, this might come up. We say that the condition for that while loop is while there is more than one tank left, keep doing this loop. And then let's say that the yield was come back next frame. So then what we'd have is a function that wouldn't finish until there was only one tank left. So you'd say, while there is not one tank left, do this. Come back next frame. Oh, there's still not one tank left. Come back next frame. Oh, there's still not one tank left. Come back next frame. Until there was, and then the function would finish. Could be quite useful. You remember the start function calls start coroutine. The coroutine that it's starting is the game loop. So let's have a quick look at the game loop to see what's going on there. Game loop is saying yield return, start coroutine, round starting. So do you remember when it says yield, it waits for whatever it's got to the right of it to finish before it continues on. So when it's saying yield return, start coroutine, it's waiting for that coroutine to finish before it goes on to the next one. So what's going to happen here is it's going to do round starting, wait for round starting to finish, then come back in. Then it's going to do round playing, wait for round playing to finish, then it's going to come back in, etc. for round ending. Finally, we're going to check if there is a game winner. So if game winner is not equal to null, so if there is a game winner, then load the current level, application.loadLevel, loaded level. That's just reloading this current level. If there isn't a game winner, then it's going to call start coroutine. And notice that there is no yield return on that bit. So it's not going to wait and then come back in. We're just going to call that, then the function will finish and there will be another game loop running.
So now we get into the point where we're looking at how the game manager and tank managers interplay. So this slide is going to kind of populate over time, but the way that we're going to do this is that we're going to animate in each point, we're going to talk about it, and then we're going to fill in that part of the script. So hopefully we can kind of step you guys through it and it will make sense. So we've just talked about the game loop. So the game loop starts off with the round starting. So the first thing that needs to happen in the round starting is we need to reset all the tanks. So we need to set them up at their positions on the spawn points. We need to enable their control and all these kind of things. So the way that we do that is to pass to the tank manager, hey, can you reset everything and reposition everything? And that's what the tank manager does. So every tank, remember, has a tank manager assigned to it, and we do that. We start off a game loop, we reset the tanks, and the tank manager is in charge of resetting things. So reactivating and setting the positions back where they should be. And we start off by disabling all the tank controls. And we have in the tank manager disable control. So we can't move, shoot, and the UI is off. When the game starts, you'll see round one, and then the tanks are there, but they don't have their health UI just yet. Then we do three more things to start the round. We need to set up the camera position and the size. So in other words, we take an average of the two tanks' positions, and we set up the zoom using the size. We increment the round number, so if it's 0, we make it round 1. And then we set up the message UI, which will say either round 1 or whatever is appropriate. So let's go and actually look at that in the script now.
So currently, round starting just has this yield return start wait. So all it's going to do is wait for 3 seconds and then do nothing else. So what we want to do is put in a little bit of code before that. First off, we said we wanted to reset all the tanks. So before the yield return, put a couple of lines so you got some space, and then we've got a function called reset all tanks. So put a call to that. Next, we'll put disable tank control, because we don't want people to be able to control their tanks while the round is actually starting. We want to wait for the round playing for them to be able to control everything. Then you remember we wanted to make sure that the camera is set to that exact size and position. We don't want it to smoothly transition to that. We want to set it. So on the camera control, so m_camera control dot set start position and size, open close parentheses. So all that's doing is on the camera control calling a function. Next, we want to increment the round number because a new round has just started. So that's m_round number ++. All that does is just add 1 to that round number. And now we've got the incremented round number, we can set the message text to be something appropriate like round and then the round number. So m_message text.text, because it's the text part of the text component. Well named, isn't it? Okay, and we're going to set that to round plus round number.
Now, it's very crucial here that you put round and a space inside your string. Otherwise, it will just say round 1 like that on the screen, which you don't want. So make sure you put a space in the string, and then we're adding on the actual number onto the end of that. And it will pass it straight into the UI text.
Okay, so let's save the script there and give it a test, see how that works.
Okay, so I'm going to save my script, switch back to Unity, and I'm going to press play.
Okay, so this isn't working as well as I thought it might.
Interestingly, it's just counting up the rounds. Why would that be, James?
Probably we need to actually enable the controls in like the round playing bit. That'll probably do it.
Okay, so all we've done so far is to say we want to start the round, and all the round start knows how to do is to set up the UI, set up the tanks, and then just be like, okay, well, I'm going to wait. Oh, hey, there's a new round, and I'm going to wait now. Oh, hey, there's a new round. It doesn't actually let us play the game because we didn't do that yet. So I'm going to stop play and jump back into my code. Okay,
so round playing, we've got this yield return null there. So what yield return null means is come back the next frame. That's all it's doing there.
So just to jump back to the slide, as we said before, we've done round starting, and those are the things that happen. Tank Manager is taking care of the resetting and disabling control, so that's all good. But round playing, so what do we do in round playing? Well, we need to enable the tank control. When we played just now, we noticed that you couldn't drive or shoot. So enable control is in Tank Manager. It can move, it can shoot, and it sets up the UI. And the thing it needs to do is empty that message. So as soon as we start playing, we don't want to see the word round 1 on the screen. We want to just scrub that out. So we don't disable the UI or do anything else just like that. We just empty the message string. And then, as James was saying earlier with the coroutine, we just keep waiting until there's one tank left. Let's see how we write that.
So at the start, as it said on the slide, we want to enable tank control so you can actually play the game. So we've got a function that does that, and all this function does is loops through all the tanks and calls their enable control. So nothing really to it. Next, we want to empty that message text. So m_message_text equals string.empty. So that's just a blank string.
Naturally, you could also just do that if you wanted to, but we're not doing it that way. We're going to go with the string.empty.
Okay, so it's looking good so far, but now all it's going to do is it's going to enable the tank control, blank the string, and then wait at one frame, and then go on to the round ending. So we don't want that. What we want is to use that while loop that we saw earlier. So for a while loop, it's while, open parentheses, and then the condition within the parentheses. So we've got a function that's one tank left, which returns true if there is one tank left, or less.
Yeah, there is a condition where it can be a draw, you'll see.
Yeah. So this will keep doing whatever's within the brackets as long as there is not one tank left.
So the thing that needs to go in there is our yield return null. So what I should be doing with my while loop is placing it around yield return null, like that. Just adding lots of lines for no reason. There we go. So until that's true, it's just going to keep going away one frame and waiting for it to become true. Okay, we'll save that. Switch back to Unity. And I'm going to hit play and see what happens. Okay, I've just muted my audio for the sake of everyone. So
I knew it.
I can drive around. That's pretty cool. I can shoot stuff. Okay, so this is maybe a point to, hook up with a neighbor and start shooting at each other. But what you'll also notice is that that's great. Now I can move around, but I've got no idea who won that round or what happened. I'll just keep infinitely adding new rounds and keep playing in an endless war, which I think we all know is wrong. So, so we need to have a round ending. We need something to happen. We need some logic to say what's going to happen when one tank kills the other tank. Okay? So, back to our slides. Round ending is our next coroutine within the overall loop. So the first thing we need to do is really disable the controls. It's kind of great to be driving around and showboating once you've won the game, but it's a little bit jazzy for my taste. So really we're going to disable the tank controls. You're going to stop dead. The camera's going to focus in on where you are. It kind of puts a nice pause in the game as well. And then we're going to clear the existing round winner. So if we've already had a round played, we want to clear out that winner and decide who's just won this round. We want to check to see if any of the round winners have 5 rounds won and therefore are the game winner. And then we want to put that into the message UI and say, okay, well, first off, this person just won the round. This tank has this many kills. This tank has this many kills. Or we're going to say, hey, this person won the entire game. So let's have a look at how that works. So back in our code, the next coroutine, remember IE numerator means coroutine, round ending. And we've currently got a yield that has the end wait.
So before we wait, we need to do a bunch of stuff. Like we said, we're going to disable tank control. So we'll call that disable tank control function. Next, we said we need to clear out that round winner before we can check for another one. So what we're going to do is set m_round winner to equal null. So that's just saying, for this round, we don't know who's won yet. We'll need to check.
So the round winners, remember, are tank managers. So it's referring to a particular tank. Same for the game winner. It's referring to a particular tank via its tank manager.
So once we're not sure if there's a round winner, we then can check. So we say that m_round winner equals get round winner. So what that's going to do is it will assume that there is 1 or fewer tanks left and then go through all of them until it finds one that's active and return it.
Should we have a look at that function?
Yeah, we can have a quick look at that.
So if you scroll down, it's around 130 for me, but it might be different for you. But what you'll see is get round winner.
And it's going to go through all of the tanks.
So it's looking for the array, looking at everyone in the array, i.e. the length of the array.
And then if it finds a tank manager whose instance is active, so its active self is true, then it's going to return that tank. If it gets all the way through the array and hasn't found anything, then it's going to return null. So if it's not found anything that's active, it's going to return null. That means there's going to be a draw. And that happens if both tanks manage to blow themselves up at the same time.
It is possible. I've seen it maybe once. Next.
Okay, so now after we've found that round winner, we're going to check whether it is null or not. So if that round winner is not equal to null,
so exclamation mark for not equal to,
then what we can do is add to that round winner's number of wins. So m_round winner dot number of wins, or m_wins plus plus, just to iterate it once.
So the round winner, remember, links to the tank manager for that tank. So it says, hey, this tank, the number of wins that tank's got, let's add 1 to it.
Okay, next, after we've added 1 to somebody's number of rounds that they've won, they might have won the entire game. So now we can check if there is a game winner. So m_game winner equals get game winner.
Yeah, let's just take a look at get game winner. So yet again, it's very similar to get round winner. Instead of checking if it's found something that's active, we're just saying, hey, has this particular tank in the list of tanks in the array, is the number of wins equal to the number of rounds required to win the entire game? If so, return that particular tank that's got the right number of wins. If not, return null.
Once we've found a game winner, we want to get a message based on whether there is no round winner, no game winner, whether there is a game winner, etc. So we've got a function for doing that. And what we're doing is creating a string called message and setting it equal to the end message return. And then once we've got that message, setting the message text to that message. So if we wanted to do anything else with the message in between, then we could do that here. We're not actually going to do anything, so we're just setting the text straight away.
So we're calling this end message function. So end message is how we actually calculating what to do at this point. So, or what to write on the screen. So I'm going to scroll down and look at this very confusing looking set of strings and text. So like before, we have this way of coloring text, and we had that function further up, which uses this rich text. So we've got a bunch of different things that it could do. So by default, what we do is we say, okay, well, let's just have a default condition. And that default condition is that there's a draw. Because when there's a draw, we don't really need to increment anything at all. So we don't worry about it at all. So we're just going to put in draw as our default text for end message. Then we decide if something different than a draw has happened. So we check, hey, is round winner not null? I.e., is there a round winner? Then we're going to send something to the message. So the message this time will be the round winner with colored text saying, hey, player 1, space, wins the round. Okay? So then we have something added onto the message. So remember, message is our overall piece of text that we're going to put into that text field. So we just keep adding stuff to it in order to create a paragraph of different things within the overall message. So message as a string then gets added all of these. So this \n just means go to a new line. So we're just spacing out this text, just having this person won the round, move down a couple of lines, then start writing something else. Then, once we've moved down 4 new lines, we have a for loop. So with that for loop, we're going through all of the tanks that are available, and within those, we're adding to the message some information. So quite simply, what we're doing here is adding on the particular tank colored with player text, then a colon and a space. So it might be, say, player 1, colon, space, and then the number of wins that are found for that tank. So it looks at the tank manager and it says, how many wins have you got so far? Print that as a number, and then put in a space and the word wins. Then put in a new line and do it again for the next tank in the loop. So you'll have player 1, colon, space, this many wins, player 2, and so on. Then what we're doing after that is saying, hey, is there a game winner? Because if there's a game winner, we don't want to do any of the stuff above. We don't want to actually write all of this stuff in. So instead of saying, hey, message plus equals, we're just clearing it out by saying equals. We're saying the message is going to be exactly this thing. And in that instance, we check the game winner, color it with the right text, and we say space wins the game. So it might be player 1, might be player 2, wins the game. That's the only message you'll see on the screen. You won't see the number of other wins that were won or anything like that. We clear it out, put it in. That's whoever won the game. Then we return that message. So whenever we call end message, we return that piece of text depending on what's just happened in the round. So when we're using end message back up in round ending, that's what we're doing. And finally, the piece of text after it gets assigned to the component's text field. Message there. And I'm going to just jump back onto my slide real quick. What I'm going to do now is save the script. But we need you to pair up with someone and fight, because it's a tank game and that's how it works. So remember, you've got W, A, S, and D for one player and spacebar to fire. Then you've got arrow keys and return for the other player. So save your scene, grab a neighbor, and give it a test. Okay, so we're going to do the same. I'm playing Dark Side, what's going on? Oh. It works. You're saying something about crushing me. Oh, I see. I see what you're doing. Oh. to get it back.
I'll submit it next time.
Sorry.